Hi there folks, and welcome to Get Strumming. Now today you'll notice that I haven't got my ukulele with me. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to do a film review on the movie Midas, which was released last week on Amazon Prime. Now I'm a little bit late to the party because, like I say, this has already been out for a week and there's been millions of other reviews about the movie, but I thought I'd chuck my hat in the ring with a review. So here goes. Yeah, the film, it's funny actually, about 5 or 6 years ago, a friend of mine said, why hasn't there been a film about Brian Epstein? Because obviously over the years there's been plenty of films about the Beatles, particularly the early days of the Beatles, like The Early Beatles, which was a movie, I think it was a straight-to-TV movie done in the 1970s. Then 30 years ago you had Backbeat, that brilliant movie starring Ian Hart as John Lennon and also Stephen Dorff as Stuart Sutcliffe. So that was obviously more to do with Stuart Sutcliffe. This movie, though, focuses entirely on Brian Epstein. So it's Jacob Fortune Lloyd as Brian Epstein, directed by Joe Stevenson. And obviously I'm not a film buff. I'm just a layperson, average Joe, watching a movie. What I did ascertain from it was that it really seemed like a stage play that was adapted for the cinema. And the reason that I thought that was just there were one or two scenes, the way that they were blocked, the way that they were arranged, I could just see it being performed on a stage. For example, there were a lot of scenes where Jacob Fortune Lloyd as Sir Epstein would be addressing the viewer straight to the camera, talking in the first person, and there were certain scenes where it almost appeared to be walking on the spot with the scenery going past him. And I thought that would work really well on the stage. So yes, I don't know if it was intended originally to be a stage play, but that's certainly how it came across. That's not a criticism, by the way. It's just my own observation on how the presentation actually looked. So it did appear to me as almost like a stage version adapted for the screen. But I did like it. I did like the way that he sort of walks away from the main narrative, almost breaks the fourth wall, and addresses the camera. I thought that worked really well, and that happens right from the offset. So I've made a few notes here as I'm going along, so quite often I'll be back and forwards within the narrative. It's obviously Alistair Taylor is included in the film. Now, Alistair Taylor stuck with the Beatles right through to till when they broke up. And for any Beatles fans out there, I don't know if you remember seeing a poster for Apple, and it has the heading, "This man has talent," and there's a photo of a guy looking just like John Lennon in 1967 with a pair of round glasses, playing a banjo, almost like a one-man band, and it was advertising for people to send the cassettes and recordings to Apple. Anyway, it's Alistair Taylor who's actually on that picture. So Alistair Taylor is almost like Brian Epstein's right-hand man in the story. A great use of it's great to show the relationship between Brian and his mum and dad, Harry and Queenie Epstein. And also Clive, because he had an older brother as well, and the fact that they were really quite wealthy, middle-class Jewish Liverpool family, and they were really trying to get Brian to, take a leading role in the running of the Epstein's department store in Liverpool. And it mentions really early on that Brian had a theatrical bent. He'd been to RADA, that didn't really come to much, and he really wanted to set up his own department selling records in his dad's furniture shop. So that's how NEMS was set up, North End Music Stores, and they feature that really well. I'm glad that they covered that. Let's see, yeah. Also, from early on in the movie is Alan Williams, the original Beatles manager, played by Eddie Izzard. Always loved Eddie Izzard. I think he's a really brilliant comedian. Whether or not he played Alan Williams accurately, I mean, Alan Williams was sort of short, curly haired at the time. I think he had a beard as well. And he had this really squeaky, high-pitched Scouse accent. And I don't think Eddie Izzard really looked much like Alan Williams, but I guess that they got Eddie Izzard in because they needed a big name. And later on in the movie, you also get Jay Leno playing, the American chat show host, playing Ed Sullivan. Again, he doesn't look anything like Ed Sullivan, but I'm guessing they wanted a big name to attract people to the movie. So, but yeah, it was nice to see Eddie Izzard there anyway. There was a great bit earlier on, for anybody of a certain age, probably my age, that remembers Rick Mail and Aid Edmondson's Bottom comedy series. They had the theme tune from Bottom. I think it was an old blues standard anyway, but they had that, and they had that playing over a sequence where Brian was prepping the Beatles to become stars and showing them how to bow. And I thought it was a good usage of that particular music, because it kind of accompanied the zaniness of the early Beatles, the way that they clown around. So that was quite good. Just on the subject of music now, they didn't use any original Beatles music. Now, initially, I thought, how can you have a movie at this period without any Beatles music? But they did it really well. They did use certain songs that Beatles played, like Some Other Guy, used in the Cavern sequences, which was their big sort of number. There mustn't have been copyright issues with that, so they did use that. They used Please Mr. Postman as well. Whoever the musicians were who covered these Beatles renditions, I thought they did really well. I'm guessing it wasn't the actors, but whoever the musicians were, yeah, I think they did a really good job of recreating that early Beatles sound. Yeah. There was just one other, my only real gripe with the music was that later on in the scene where they're doing the Royal Command performance, and there's a great clip of them in the car, and this is pretty much accurate as to how I've heard the story, that John was initially wanting to say, well, I could do anything, I could swear on stage, no one's going to stop me. And they were saying, no, John, don't really, just keep it, keep it clean. Because originally he was going to say, and the rest of you, you can rattle your fucking jewellery. And he was going to drop the F-bomb. And I thought that was really good that they featured this. And when it came to the reenactment of the Royal Variety performance, now I've got to get the guy's name right now who played John. I've just got it here now. Let's have a look. I've made a note of the actors because they really do need a mention. What's his name now? Jonah Lees, that's it. Now, just on the subject of the Beatles, I thought the actors that playing John, Paul, George and Pete and Ringo, I thought they nailed it personally. The impressions, the vocal mannerisms. It's not easy to replicate the characters who are so widely known. Especially if you're a young actor as well, because you're really gonna have to do your research on each vocal mannerism, all the different nuances between the characters. I just thought they did really, really well, considering as well that basically the Beatles are kind of not on the periphery of this story, but they certainly, the focus isn't on them. It's Brian Epstein, it's the Brian Epstein story. And you've got to keep coming back to that. When you say, oh, they didn't get this right, they didn't get that. Look, it's a movie. It's about Brian Epstein. So I think it was a very tough number they were given to actually play John, Paul, George and Pete and Ringo, and they did it great. The criticism that everybody's saying, and I totally agree, John Elise was just that little bit too short. They could have done with they could have given him some lifts or something just to sort of put his height, on par at least with Paul and George. Because John, and I think John, it was about 5'9", 5'10" or something. I think Paul might have been 5'11", George might have been 5'9", and then Ringo was about 5'6". But yeah, the height differential, for the Beatles fans out there, and maybe even sort of the average viewer might just think, was John really that short? But anyway, if you get past that, I think John Elise did a really, really good job at playing John. Maybe not enough edge, but that's not the actor's fault, that's in the writing. I think John could have been a little bit more biting, sarcastic. But one thing that I did come away from this film was that they played it safe. It wasn't really gritty, but then nowadays people do tend to play it safe with a lot of biopics, especially like if you remember the Bohemian Rhapsody, the Queen film. There was a lot that they could have gone into with Freddie's private life, but they kept it more for a family audience, and I'm guessing that that's what they've done with this movie as well. Anyway, sorry, I'm sort of getting a little bit beyond myself here. There's the humour in the movie was great. There was one bit when they'd gone down to the Decca audition on the 1st of January 62, I think it was. Now, this might not be entirely accurate because I think the Beatles were already down in London at the time, but I might be wrong. Some Beatles historians might be able to correct me on this. But I think that they were already in London and they got really hammered the night before on New Year's Eve. But in the movie, it has them driving down from Liverpool, because John says, it was summer when we left Liverpool, and they're all piling out the van and it's snowing and they're all shivering, which I thought was a good gag. There's also the scene with Dick Rowe when he basically turns Brian down with his offer of the Beatles, and he said, the famous quote, "Guitar bands are on the way out, Brian. Just there'll be another band that comes along. You're wasting your time." And I thought Dick Rowe with his big cigar there, scoffing at Brian, I just thought that was really well done. As to Brian's private life, again, I think it could have been done a little bit more grittier. There's a great scene when he's on the harbour side having a gay encounter, and the police chasing him off. Which did happen. I think, again, they played it safe. They just gave you enough information to kind of get the idea as to what was going on, but they didn't, it wasn't too graphic, like it might have been if they'd have made the film maybe 30 years ago. I know one or two Beatles nuts out there will find quite a few inaccuracies with certain things. For example, when they were at Abbey Road and George Harrison made the comment to George Martin, well, I don't like your tie, and it shows John and Paul in this scene going sniggering to themselves. They didn't do that. They were really livid with George because they thought, you're taking a mick out the producer. We're going to be fired before we've even started. And I think they were really they gave George the daggers, if you like. But in the film here, they sort of sniggering to themselves. Does it really matter? Probably not. But if you're a Beatles purist, you'd say, nah, that didn't quite happen like that. I mean, the guy that played George Martin, again, don't get me wrong, these actors really, for what they were given, you know, to do, I think they did a really, really good job. It's a little bit twee, the dialogue between George Martin and, you need better control, John. You're straining all the top notes. It must be like gargling gravel. And what was it, Pete? You need more precision, more snap. And I'm thinking, as a musician, what kind of direction? More snap. What does all this mean? You need better control over your voice. Well, how do I do that? You know, and they just kind of almost like generic sort of meaningless comments that a record producer, to the average member of the public, might think, oh yeah, he knows what he's talking about. But I'd just be thinking, they're not really. It's not really making much sense. This. I do like the fact that George Martin seemed to single Paul out as being, you know, you've got a great voice, because I think it was Paul who made the biggest impression on George Martin. So I think they did get that right. Oh yeah, as well. I'll just go through the other actors as well. So you've got Leo Harvey Elledge, who plays George. Brilliant, really. I thought he nailed the part. The sarcasm of George, and the fact that he was just there in the sidelines, but just making these little quips. Then the slanted jaw as well, when George used to speak with it out the side of his mouth. I just thought he absolutely nailed it. Blake Richardson, who played Paul McCartney, again, there's certain points in the movie, you look at him and you think, my God, he looks just like a young Paul McCartney. And he's got the vocal expression. It's not easy, basically doing an impersonation of such well-known musicians, you know. So I really do think that they did the best. The guy that played George Martin, I've got the actor's name here, but he actually looks a little bit like Giles Martin, George Martin's son. Maybe the hair was a little bit too floppy for that time in the period, because George Martin kind of grew his hair a little bit longer, maybe towards the end of the Beatles' tenure in like 1969 or something. So George's hair was quite short, whereas but I mean, I'm really nitpicking here, you know. I'm talking like a proper Beatles nut. I mean, they did get the instruments right. I remember when they brought out the first stills of the movie a few years ago, and it had like a right-handed violin bass, and it wasn't even a proper Hofner. I thought, come on, you're going to have to really get this right, otherwise people are going to get cross. Anyway, well, as far as I could see, they certainly got all, like John's Rickenbacker, Paul's Hofner, the proper cavern Hofner with the pickups closer together, like basically the Hofner that has just recently been found. So they've you know, I thought they'd done really well at getting the instruments right for a start, and the fact that they did use Abbey Road as well, because I've had the absolute fortune of going to Abbey Road studio. God, twice? No, in fact 3 times I've been there now, because I went there working there once, and then as a tourist for a couple of times. And you can see the steps that George Martin and Brian Epstein are walking down, and it's definitely the Abbey Road steps. So I'm glad that they used Abbey Road studio. Just going back to something as well that I mentioned before, just about the Royal Command performance that I forgot to mention when John was going to swear. And it shows they absolutely nailed John's speech. John Elise, the people in the cheap seats clap your hand, the rest of you just rattle your jewellery. Ladies and gentlemen. And then they go straight into money. What? And it was like the whole scene up to that point had been done perfectly. Every little pause, every little bit, even when John looks to the side as if he's about to say drop the F-bomb. And then he doesn't. But then you've got to go into twist and shout, and they went into money. And I thought, oh man. But then again, you know, it was probably a copyright issue maybe. But that was just a little bit. If they'd have gone into twist and shout, that would have really raised the heckles on my neck. But just going into money, great song, but just not accurate in the slightest. Okay then, so let's have a look. Yeah, Wallace Campbell playing Ringo. He was just cuddly Ringo, and he really nails that as well. Eddie Marsan as Harry Epstein. Great performance. Maybe they could have included Harry and Queenie Epstein a little bit more into the story. I mean, the film was an hour and 52, so you had, a lot of time to flesh out the story. I'd have liked to have maybe seen a little bit more of the relationship between Brian and his mum and dad. Eddie Marsan, by the way, also played Amy Winehouse's dad in the recent Amy Winehouse film, which I think he was absolutely brilliant in. Darcy Shaw as Cilla Black, she was brilliant. There was no denying, because right when, at the beginning of the film, when Brian walks into the cavern and the cloakroom attendant starts chatting, and you can tell immediately it's Cilla Black. And I thought Darcy Shaw did a brilliant job there. Just just as an aside here, if anyone gets to the chance, you haven't seen it, the Cilla biopic starring Sheridan Smith. If we're on the topic of biopics, that's an absolute blinder of a biopic. That's one of the best biopics I've ever seen. Yeah, I think it was called Cilla, actually. Anyway, yeah. What else? Yeah, Brian Epstein. As I say, Jacob Fortune Lloyd, he plays Epstein brilliantly. The only thing is, he just tends to look a little bit older. A little bit too old in comparison to the Beatles. There was only, I think, how old was he when he passed away? He was 32 in 67, and I think Lennon was about 27. So there's only about 5 years between Lennon and Epstein, but this seems to be at least 10. So there's a little bit of an age discrepancy there. Yeah, historical bits. They really did skirt over Pete Best's sacking. I don't think that there was enough. I don't think that there was enough emphasis on given to the fact that Pete Best was essentially sacked by John, Paul, and George. And I know that they make the point that George Martin said, look, you can do what you want with him on stage, but we need a proper drummer. And it was made out that was kind of the decision, that the deciding factor as to why Pete was replaced by Ringo. But they kind of avoided also the extra input from John, Paul and George that they wanted him out. So it just kind of made it look as though it just wasn't any good for the studio, so we'll just get Brian to get rid of him on George Martin's insistence. But I don't think that was quite the full story. They could have really had a scene with John, Paul and George saying, look, we need him out, Brian, and it's you that's going to do the sacking. Because that was a big deal. Poor old Brian was, given the short straw there of having to sack one of the guys. And, it just shows, some of the stuff that Brian had to do. In fact, there was another scene when John made the remark about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus. Now, Brian had flu at the time, and if you look at the interview with him, there is an interview on YouTube that you can find when he's basically speaking to the cameras and saying that here's the quote from John Lennon, and it's saying that he was misquoted. And if you look at Brian, he looks absolutely haggard. The poor guy had been taken out of his sick bed. And I think they could have made more of a point of that how ill he was and how exhausted he was. By the way, when it shows the press conference when John says, I pointed out that fact in reference to England, saying that we meant more to kids than Jesus did. He absolutely, John Elise as well, nails it, that speech that John gives to the press. Absolutely brilliant. I've got to say I'm really impressed with the guys that played John, Paul, George and Pete and Ringo. let's see, yeah, the celebration of From Me to You as well. Now, there's always been a bit of contention as to which was the first Beatles #1, whether it was Please Please Me and which chart. I think the official charts say that it was From Me to You, so that's the big number that they celebrate being at #1. There's a great little bit to camera, again, breaking the fourth wall, where Brian's talking about each of his acts, and they're all on a staircase like a bunch of kids fighting each other. So you've got the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer, and the Dakotas. Was it Tommy Quickly as well? I think he was one of Larry Parnes' stable originally. I might be wrong. But anyway, you've got them all on this staircase and squabbling and playfully, all these acts there. And I thought that was a really nice little scene. Again, that would have been done brilliantly on a stage, a theatrical stage. Yes, so, and these, one of the most powerful scenes was that between Nat Weiss in New York and Brian breaking down, showing his emotion at just being absolute. When I think it was Tex, who was Brian's lover, who had made away with a suitcase with 20 grand in it. I'm not entirely sure if that was made up for the movie. In fact, I'm not entirely sure of Brian's personal life as to what relationships he had. I imagine the character of Tex may have been created just to push the story along, and that almost like an amalgamation of different relationships Brian might have had. But I'm not, it's ages since I read the biography on Brian Epstein, and I'm not entirely sure as to if he was an actual guy. I think it'll have been an amalgamation. But the scene with Nat Weiss when Brian Epstein breaks down, that was beautifully done. Really, really good, you know, showing the emotion and just how exhausted Brian was. Again, at the end of the movie, there's a group hug as with the Beatles just before that they do the All You Need Is Love performance. Again, that would work really well on a stage. Yeah, so sort of as a sort of closing resume of the whole thing, biopics are never going to be accurate. They're always going to be there's whoever has written the piece and whoever's directing it, they've got a point that they want, they've got their own story that they want to tell. And liberties with the truth are always going to be taken for either narrative purposes or dramatic effect. And some important elements of historical accuracy might be redacted if they're not integral to the story. So, i.e. Pete Best's sacking might have been in another biopic, such as the early Beatles, might have been a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more in depth. But again, this is Brian's story. Another instance of reality being changed for dramatic effect would be in the film Nowhere Boy, with Sam Taylor Johnson, I think his name, or was that his name, who played John Lennon, bus surfing. He jumps on the roof of this double-decker bus, and I think Paul McCartney said, John would have never done that. I mean, you've got to remember as well, John was half blind, so he'd probably struggled to even see what he was doing. But, you know, it looks good, this image of the, you know, rebellious teenager jumping on the roof of a bus and bus surfing his way through Liverpool. But again, it's done there for dramatic effect. You're making a movie, you want to make it exciting. I think that there are certain elements that have really been missed out of the story. For a story that was 1 hour 52, I expected them to go into Lennon and Epstein's relationship a little bit more, as to whether or not, like Paul McCartney said, he didn't think that there was a homosexual tryst between Lennon and Epstein, but he did think that there was a power play going on between Lennon and Epstein, because John was quite a political animal, and he wanted to be there at the forefront, like with the Maharishi. He wanted to be the guy that was in the helicopter, and none of the others had a look in. And then I think the same applies to Epstein, that he went on holiday to Spain because he wanted to show Epstein who was the boss of the Beatles. And I think they could have mentioned that. There was also another scene where I thought that they were going to show it, and that was Bob Wooler, the Cavern DJ, who got beaten up quite viciously by Lennon at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday. And I thought they were going to show that scene because, again, it's you know, quite an important part of the Beatles' history, that the first, Lennon says this himself, the first bit of publicity, national press coverage the Beatles got was John beating up and hospitalising Bob Wooler. Now, they may not have shown this, again, because it might not have been integral to Brian Epstein's story, and also the fact that nowadays, I think, directors and film producers are playing it safe with the biopics. They don't like to go too dark, and I think that might have been a little bit too violent for modern audiences. I do think that they might have been trying to aim this at more of a family audience. You didn't get a lot of swearing, you didn't get a lot of violence, or certainly I expected a bit more viciousness from John's character, who seems a little bit sort of more reserved in this. That's the one criticism, not a criticism of the actors, more just of the script was a little bit twee at points and could have been a little bit meatier. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I haven't covered here. Yeah, on the whole, I would say I'd give it probably 6.5, maybe a 7 out of 10. I know a lot of people might say that the acting might have been a little bit sort of twee, but I think you've got to remember as well, you can't criticise the actors too much. They can only work with what they're being given. And as a story about Brian Epstein, at points, I kind of wish the film could have chosen a little bit more. Is it about Brian, or is it about Brian and the Beatles? To me, this really still did come across as a Brian Epstein and his journey with the Beatles. Now, it was called Midas Man, so the idea is to show that he had the Midas touch when it came to discovering talent. But I would have liked to seen a little bit more of Brian's private life, considering the movie he was the main protagonist, pardon me, in the movie. But it's been done now, and at least there is a biopic about Brian Epstein out there now. Whether or not another one will come along in the future is yet to be seen. But as a first attempt, I'd say that, yeah, they did a nice job. You know, there's a lot of key people featured there, his mum and dad and his brother. Maybe they could have gone into a little bit more detail with his relationship with his mum and dad. But on the whole, yeah, I would give the film as a 21st century take on what is essentially now a 60-odd-year-old story. I think they did a pretty good crack at it, to be honest. So yeah, there you go. That is my critique, if you like, of Midas Man. You probably got your own opinions, but those are just mine on first viewing. I'll probably give it another viewing, and now I've also given my review, I'll check another few reviews out, and I'll probably think, yeah, you're right, or no, you're not right. But anyway, here's my 2 penneth worth, and Bertie is needing a walk now, so we're going to continue in the woods. So all the best, take care, and don't forget, keep on strumming. Bye-bye.